Good morning, everyone. My name is Clark Mercer. I'm the director here at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this roundtable on historic preservation and affordable housing. And we're thrilled to be hosting this event with the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation's Chair, Sara Bronin, and the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation Foundation. And I know that we're all going to appreciate and learn a great deal from this incredible panel we have with us today. It's an honor to be hosting the ACHP here for this event, and I want to thank Chair Bronin for her leadership and her team, Adam Bronheim, Lynn Richmond for their efforts and willingness to convene this roundtable here at COG. I also want to acknowledge Manuel Ochoa, whose leadership in the ACHP Foundation was a key reason we are all here today. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or COG, as we know it here locally, it's a nonprofit association of 24 local governments, and we convene local and state, federal leaders to solve regional challenges such as transportation, the environment, climate change, public safety, and homeland security, as well as housing and homelessness. And we know the need for housing is severe in metropolitan Washington, and housing that is affordable to lower and moderate income households most significantly. Recognizing this need, our board of directors took action in September 2019 to set a 10-year housing production target for the region. And these targets included 3 goals: the amount of housing needed, 320,000 units, or 75,000 above and beyond what's otherwise anticipated. And it articulated where these units should be: 75% of all new units produced near high capacity transit in areas of planned future growth. And then the affordability, and we all know that word can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. The affordability of those units, 75% of all new units created having a housing cost of $2,500 per month or less. Although we have not yet hit our annual production target, with the pandemic and its impacts being a major factor, this region is a dynamic and creative one, willing to innovate with housing policy and zoning practice to address this complex challenge. And we have a lot of leaders in this room who have been playing a key part in that. And one of the folks on your panel, Karl, from the city of Alexandria, has led the way on zoning reform and housing. And we've come together as a region in other unique ways to address housing affordability and equity. In 2023, we submitted the first regional fair housing plan in over 20 years. And I want to acknowledge Manuel Ochoa, who is here with us today, who is part of the team that created this plan. Earlier this year, COG was fortunate to receive a first-round HUD Pathways to Removing Obstacles to Housing grant, which will accelerate work at the local and regional level to address challenges to affordable housing production. There are several aspects to this plan that include preservation, which we recognize is an integral component of how we will be able to meet our region's housing needs. We're just getting started, so please stay tuned for more on this in the months and years to come. Before I turn it over to Chair Bronin to kick off our panel today, I want to make sure to cover a few basic housekeeping activities first. If you haven't found it, which is the first thing I always look for, there's coffee in the room adjacent here, as well as breakfast, and bathrooms are out in the back hallway. So go through the double glass doors towards the elevators, and there's a bathroom on either side of the elevators. Our Wi-Fi information is printed out on the desk by the entry to the boardroom. And again, we're very grateful for you to be here today. This is an important set of topics that merits deep discussion and not just buzzwords and euphemisms, but some real discussion and thought with how we're going to produce more housing, affordable housing, and address historic preservation. So thank you all for being here, and good luck today. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Clark, for having us here today and for hosting. This is a pretty cool room. You probably can't see it online. Welcome to those who are joining us online. But it definitely makes us feel very official. So thanks, and thanks for breakfast. Thanks to Manuel too for making the connections. I am joined here today by the executive director of the ACHP, Reed Nelson, who is in the audience and has been a partner in many of the things that I will tell you relating to what ACHP has been working on in the area of housing and historic preservation. But I would be remiss if I didn't really underscore what Clark just said about the DC region. It's a vibrant region. DC, as a resident of DC, I'm going to say that DC is the heart of that region. But I do think that our city is made all the more vibrant by the local governments, different towns that are coordinated by the COG. So that's 20 of them, I think. We know that housing in particular is a regional issue, that we see trends across different metro areas. It's not just DC. When one jurisdiction doesn't provide enough housing, the burden falls on the other jurisdictions. And I'm really grateful today that we have a group of speakers who can speak to those types of dynamics and can talk about the opportunities that preservationists have to move housing supply, affordability, and accessibility forward. So just wanted to say, kudos to COG for bringing everybody together, not just for today's conversation, but across so many years of work in trying to make the city, the region more sustainable, more accessible, more affordable, and better connected. So with that, I just wanted to provide some brief framing remarks about the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It's a very small agency, so I wanted to just explain maybe what it is, what it does really briefly, and explain why we are interested in housing and the links between housing and historic preservation. So first, the ACHP is an independent federal agency. We have 24 members, and understanding who our members are is really important to understanding what our scope is and could be. We have 11 federal agencies that are represented on the council, 8 presidential appointees like myself. I'm the only full-time member. The others are a range of what the statute calls expert and public members. So some are deeply expert in preservation. Others are people who are interested and represent a much broader range of perspectives. We have 3 organizations represented on the council. One you may have heard of, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. A couple of others that represent key statutory partners in the federal preservation framework, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. In addition, the president appoints a governor, a mayor, and a tribal member to sit on the council. And those individuals too represent perspectives beyond just strict historic preservation. And I think they bring important insights into the work of our council. As far as what we do, that body helps to oversee a regulatory process that is, I think, perhaps little known from what I can tell during my service here, but extremely important to the way that federal government investments are made. We'll hear a little bit about this, I think, from our DC State Historic Preservation Officer on the panel and others of us who can speak to it. It's a process that's nicknamed Section 106 for the original provision of the National Historic Preservation Act, which created the ACHP and created this process. And what it does is it requires federal agencies to review the impacts of their actions on historic properties. Those are defined as properties on or eligible for the National Register, and they include a broad range of not just buildings and structures, but archaeological sites and tribal resources and more. So that process, which governs about 120,000 undertakings annually, also plays a big role in housing production. So on our panel today, we have a representative of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Virtually every dollar that HUD spends, whether for its own public housing or whether granting out to other entities to build or rehabilitate housing, goes through our Section 106 review process when this historic properties, effect on historic properties happens. And, HUD is among many agencies that actually do provide housing. Also sitting on our council is the Department of Defense, which provides military housing, the Veterans Administration, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which through grants, loans, and other programs also support the provision of housing. And again, every dollar of that goes through our process. So I just wanted to note, if, in case you didn't know, ACHP does have a pretty significant role in how housing investments get made by the federal government. We also have, as the name suggests, an advisory function, and we are supposed to advise the president, Congress, and state and local governments on a variety of issues related to historic preservation. Over the last year and a half, we've really focused on this area of housing and recently adopted a policy statement, which essentially is the council's voted on opinions of the ACHP. In that policy statement, which is called the Policy Statement on Housing and Historic Preservation, we lay out a series of broad principles that we felt that both the federal government agencies should abide by, and that's a should, it's advisory, but that also Congress and state and local governments should really start to take a look at. So we talk in that policy statement about many of the topics that we will discuss today, including the historic preservation tax credit, which has been used to create hundreds of thousands of units of housing, including our Section 106 review process, which we are moving to actively right now, and I'll talk a little about that, to reform, to improve the way that it runs for housing related projects, and also talks about the need for more data and coordination. So we'll get to a lot of the topics that we cover in the housing and historic preservation policy statement, and look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to stop here because we have a lot to cover today. And what I'm going to do is I'll sit down and I'll ask the panelists, starting with Mr. Maloney, to introduce themselves, their roles, and what their institutions or entities do. So take it away, David.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm David Maloney, the State Historic Preservation Officer in the DC Office of Planning. And we are unique in the nation in being a combined state historic preservation office and municipal historic preservation office, all in one division. So we do the whole gamut of anything related to historic preservation.
Good morning. My name is Dan Reed. I'm the Regional Policy Director for Greater Washington. We are a nonprofit that advocates for more equitable and sustainable housing, land use, and transportation policies across the DC region. I focus on our work in Maryland and Northern Virginia, primarily on housing and land use issues.
My name is Karl Moritz. I'm the Planning Director for the City of Alexandria, Virginia. In Alexandria, historic preservation is within the Planning and Zoning Department. So really anything related to the long-range planning for housing, its development and its review for historic preservation purposes comes through our department.
Good morning. I'm Kristin Fontenot. I'm the director of HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. At HUD, our core mission is safe and affordable housing for all across the nation. And the Office of Environment and Energy provides services for all the HUD programs that are looking to realize that goal, including the permitting and compliance aspects of environmental and cultural resources, as well as thinking about high performance and energy reduction when we're thinking about new construction and major renovation and rehabilitation. Happy to be here.
My name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. We're the citywide nonprofit dedicated solely to historic preservation in the city. Many of our functions include research and documentation across the city, and also project review of major development projects and those affecting historic landmarks, which we present to our DC Historic Preservation Review Board. We also participate in Section 106 review, given the massive federal presence that we have in town. Glad to be here. Thank you.
So you can see we're going to have some really interesting perspectives and conversations, including everybody here, I think, thinking at the regional level. So I just wanted to start by setting the stage about the roles of the various federal, state, and local players. So I've talked a bit about the membership of ACHP, and I neglected to state that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is, in fact, a member, one of those 24 members of the ACHP. So ACHP also includes 59, actually, state historic preservation officers. So it's the 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, Guam, and other territories, and totaling 59. We also have statutory relationships with certified local governments, including cities like Alexandria, and of course, other cities in the region. So I wanted to start with Ms. Fontenot and HUD. And so as folks probably know, HUD has the largest portfolio of historic housing in the country, with nearly 2/3 of its buildings 50 years or older. And just for National Register purposes, that 50-year date tends to be a cutoff point, or sort of an understood point at which a building could be considered historic. So that 50-year number is pretty significant. 25% of HUD's portfolio was constructed before 1950. So in light of that aging public housing stock, I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how HUD handles that housing stock, and particularly rehabilitation of it.
Thanks, Sarah. And it's a great question. And let me just start by giving a little bit of context. As I mentioned at the onset, the mission of HUD is fair, safe, and affordable housing for all. And so for us, all these conversations start with the individual people that we're serving. And so just to give a little bit of additional context when we think about public housing, and then we can get into just for a few minutes some of the other broader pieces as well. 1.6 million people across the nation live in public housing. 39% of them are led by heads of households that are aged 62 years of age or older. And at least 24% of the households that are residing in public housing across the nation have at least one person with a disability. So when we start to think about the aging infrastructure, I think about a lot of things. I think about the complexity of the individuals that we are serving. I also think about the fact that, to Sarah's point about aging infrastructure, one of the things that always resonates with me as someone who's been doing this for a really long time, and my first field work as a historic preservation specialist was after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the areas around it following that devastating hurricane, is that the places that we have built that are aging are facing new challenges than what was once faced at the time of its construction. So we have a complex situation when we think about the people we are serving, and we also have a complex situation when we think about the need for our communities to be resilient and thriving, and historic preservation becomes really interesting in those spaces, right? So for public housing is typically prioritized for renovations and repairs through what we call the capital fund. The capital fund is a fund that is funded and appropriated by Congress. And there are estimates that range in pretty broad numbers, but somewhere between $50 and $75 billion of deferred maintenance, because those funds have not been able to be prioritized over the last many years. So something I think to keep in mind when we are having these conversations, that these are not situations that are at the fault of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and certainly not the fault of public housing authorities who are working really hard to try and make housing affordable, safe, and accessible to a complex community across the country. So I want to start there because I think I hear a lot about that, and I think it's worth thinking about that when we start to think about historic preservation. But one of the other things I will offer is, at HUD, what I so appreciate about the mission is that HUD is in every single community across the nation, and it is not just about public housing. There are programs that I promise you are seeing funded when you walk down any urban area that are funded in part by HUD dollars through a variety of different programs. And I just wanted to hit a couple of those for your awareness, because these two, because they are federal dollars, are triggering this federal permitting piece and the historic preservation requirements that Sara kicked us off with. So just a couple of examples. Just in the last 2 years, this administration launched what is called the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, or GRRP, which is being used across the nation to look at ways to retrofit with energy improvements, aging infrastructure to improve affordable housing across the nation. In addition, we have the community development block grant programs that are used for disaster recovery, and a whole slew of other activities across the nation. And so when we think about affordable housing, we can think about public housing and a complex and important community that we need to be thinking about. But we also have the realities of over $30 billion just in 2024 funded and reviewed under environmental and cultural resource law across this whole of HUD's programs. So I'll stop there, Sarah, and we can continue at some point. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn actually to our SHPO, as we call them, State Historic Preservation Officers, Mr. Maloney. Now you've been in this role since 2007. So, I mean, you've really seen, DC has changed a lot since 2007, actually, and a lot of historic buildings have been rehabbed during that time. I was just wondering if you could set the stage for our viewers and attendees today to talk about the review process that the State Historic Preservation Office conducts, whether it's for conversions or of buildings from one use to another or rehabilitations of existing housing.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And yes, indeed, DC is changing very rapidly, has been for the past couple of decades, and it's going to continue. So first, for context, I'd like to just cite a few data points that explain why our program has been so active in the housing issue. In 2019, Mayor Bowser set a goal to create 36,000 new housing units, new homes in the district by 2025. And the point of that goal was to increase the housing supply and thereby blunt the increase in housing costs for many people, especially renters. And this past summer, the city met that goal early, and we are on track now to add another 12,000 housing units on top of that by the end of 2025. The district is also a national leader in affordable housing. We're continuing to build on that progress, and the city has invested more than $1.5 billion into affordable housing over the past 10 years. And per capita, that is more than any other jurisdiction in the country. We've also created and preserved more than 15,000 affordable units since 2015. A large part of that, the reason, the preservation of those units is a large part of the reason that average rents in DC have increased at only half the national average since 2019, thus meeting one of the goals of this program. So much of this is new housing, newly built housing, but some is also renovation of older and historic homes. I think there's a nationwide recognition that much of our housing problem needs to be solved using existing buildings. That's why our office has been so active in housing production, and especially production of affordable housing. So in terms of review processes and what we actually do, first of all, in terms of our federal responsibilities, we're encouraging the use of federal historic preservation tax credits. These are, of course, available nationwide. Over the past 20 years in the District of Columbia, affordable providers, housing providers, have been our most frequent users of the tax credits, more so than commercial projects. And we have produced 2,500 new or renovated affordable units, not on top of the market rate units that have been provided using the federal preservation tax credits. And a good example is the House of Lebanon project, which some of you may be familiar with. It's 82 units in the former Margaret Murray Washington High School by housing provider Mission First, and that's just up the street from where we are right now, just off North Capitol Street. Part of this push to encourage the use of federal tax credits also involves activities that we do that support access to the credit program. So two things in particular. One is nominating properties to the National Register to make them eligible to receive the tax credits, and also public education and outreach. The 2,500 units that we've produced over the past 20 years have involved about 50 buildings. And 20 of those are newly designated historic landmarks that we did in order to support the owners of those properties who wanted to make them eligible for the tax credits. And on the public education side, we, in 2015, we worked with our planning colleagues at the Office of Planning and local affordable housing providers to promote the credits and put out a publication called Pairing Historic Tax Credits with Low-Income Housing Tax Credits in DC. And in terms of, for example, the House of Lebanon project, I believe that the provider used something more than 30 types of financial support in order to make that project work. So you can see how complex these projects can be. Another area that involves Section 106 review for us is the Section 106 review of federally funded projects. Some of these are also taking advantage of the federal tax credits, but our involvement is initially through Section 106 review. A great example of that is the Appleton Flats, Appleton at Spring Flats on Spring Road in Columbia Heights, up in Midtown DC. That's 88 units in the former Hebrew Home for the Aged by Victory Housing. And that won a 2022 Historic Preservation Award from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and the Secretary of HUD. So,
And we took a great tour of the site. It was wonderful.
a fantastic building. Thank you for your support, and thanks to HUD as well. That's just one of many examples that are real success stories in the city. Section 106 review is also important for us on federal property dispositions because, as Rebecca Miller said, there is a lot of federal property here in the city, and periodically some of it is disposed. These dispositions typically result in National Register listings because the disposing agency is required to take into account the effect of the disposition on protections for the historic property. So this can include major rehabilitation opportunities. St. Elizabeth's Hospital is one example. We got 250 units of affordable housing out of the restoration of some of those buildings there. And Walter Reed Hospital also has some great opportunities and one currently underway to provide affordable housing. Upcoming too, we know that the feds are doing some additional dispositions of the Liberty Loan building. We've already had calls from developers interested in converting that to housing. And the old federal warehouse down at 7th and D Streets, which is another exciting opportunity that could provide some really interesting housing units. We have also used survey and planning grants to advance support for housing programs generally. We got a National Park Service grant to survey historically African-American affordable housing in the district. That's $70,000, and that is currently underway. And also, in terms of our local programs, we don't have access to a local tax credit for various technical reasons, or sort of not take too long to go into why we don't have a local tax credit. But nonetheless, we do have a local historic homeowner grant program where we give grants of up to $50,000 to low and moderate income homeowners for repairs to their historic homes. And the most interesting recent example in that program is the Kennesaw Apartments in Meridian Hill, Mount Pleasant area, which was the first use of that program to give grants to homeowners in a multifamily building. It required special legislation to do that, but it was a really opportunity to address a building that was really had pressing needs. This was a prominent landmark in that part of the city with a very lavish facade with lots of ornamentation. It was in severe deterioration. It's also an iconic building, especially in DC's Latino community, because it was one of the first examples of the use of the district's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act back in the 70s. So we gave nearly $500,000 in grants to about 30 owners, and also the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development put $1.5 million into the building directly to the Condo Association to enable the repairs of this building and allowing the tenants to remain in their homes. We also do, of course, under our local authorities, design review of all of the preservation construction that goes on in the city. But I'll stop there and we can move on.
Thank you. And I just, for an audience listening who may or may not be is familiar with preservation, this level of activity is not typical. It's exceptional. And I think the range, well, I mean, your dual roles too, as a SHPO, as a local government, and I think that has led to some really creative programs that have helped to support rehabilitations and conversions in the district. And I'll also just say that that kind of activity and the level of activity and the scope of the work that you do does comes from the top in a way. I mean, this is a sustained effort by DC over the years to say, we need housing. We're going to try all different tools to create it. And one of the, I think, great things about the roundtables that we've been doing is that some of these programs can come to the surface, and hope others out there may try to experiment with them. The last thing you mentioned, local designation, and we'll turn to Director Moritz next. It just is a very important part of local government's roles, of course, in the process. I do want to recognize that the one-man appeals board to the Historic Preservation Review Board is in attendance today. Peter Byrne, Georgetown professor and my co-author on a few things. So if anybody has really tough questions about what the mayor's agent role is, we'll turn to Peter. But I do want to jump across the Potomac to your historic city director, Moritz. So as you mentioned, you oversee multiple city functions, including planning and historic preservation. But I'd love for you to focus on that local regulation dimension and anything else you'd like to talk about. But curious about how you use regulation in Alexandria, how you guide your commissions, various commissions, decision-making on infill in historic districts and on rehab. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Alexandria celebrated our 275th birthday this year, so we do have a fair number of historic resources and 2 locally designated historic districts. Those 2 districts, one is the Old Historic District, established in 1946, a Parker Gray District, established in the 1980s. Both are overseen by a single board of architectural review, which is staffed by the planning department. The staffing, we do, the BAR looks at all demolitions, full and partial, all buildings, including new development and additions, staffed by a really excellent group of staff. And the location of that staff in the Department of Planning and Zoning means that when a new proposal comes in, we are coordinated on everything related to the approval of that project from day one. And I think that helps a great deal. Where we can sometimes see a conflict between, or a conflict that may impact development is really in the size of a building. Often our master plan and our zoning ordinance will allow a building of a certain size, and the BAR may find that the building of that size is perhaps overwhelming for a historic district. And so we established a system early on, or a decade ago, where proposals come in as a concept plan to the Board of Architectural Review to look at scale, mass, and general architectural character. That means that historic preservation gets an early voice in the project, but not necessarily a defining voice. And what that means is we can then work with the applicants to refine their project, normally without losing units in the case of a housing project, before it goes to the Planning Commission and City Council for approval, and then it goes back to the BAR for a certificate of appropriateness to do the additional architectural refinements. And for the most part, that's worked really, really well for us. I did want to touch just a little bit on public housing in Section 106. We do have public housing. Much of it is over 50 years old and located in the historic district and is subject to Section 106 reviews. We have been pursuing a goal of not just preserving our public housing, but with support from people at the agencies at this table, redeveloping to add additional affordable units to make sure that the people who are living in those public housing are participating in the project, but also get to come back, but also adding a market rate component. That means 3 to 5 times the density that was existing. And so that is an opportunity for us to really be collaborating with a lot of people to make sure that we can get those projects to meet our historic preservation goals as well as meet our housing supply goals. And so far, we've had 3 recent examples that have successfully gone through that process.
Great. And I'm actually going to stick with you for a minute because I wanted, you're going to be on the hot seat because you talked about historic preservation regulation.
Yes.
But I really want to talk about something that, again, falls under your purview, and that's the issue of zoning.
Yes.
So in wearing, zoning is actually a topic that we cover in the Housing and Historic Preservation Policy Statement, and specifically the need to ensure flexibility in zoning in historic districts, as well as just the overall goal to harness zoning to enable more housing creation. In my academic hat, so I'm normally a professor, I've been helping to build a project called the National Zoning Atlas, and we've actually started to log and put on the map, it's a free map, jurisdictions in the region, including DC and including Alexandria, with the help of some partners at Urban Institute and the Mercatus Center and others. And a really interesting stat came out, and DC is I think it's a larger city by landmass than Alexandria, but in Alexandria, we've clocked the city in at apartments being allowed, 4 or more units of housing being allowed in about 2/3 of the land across the city, which happens to be more than DC. Again, because we in DC sort of have these northwestern suburbs in particular. And we're always checking numbers, and you guys are always revising the zoning regulations. But just we'll get to DC in just a second. But Alexandria may see those stats because of the zoning changes that you've done recently. And I'd be interested for you to speak about what compelled those changes and kind of how you see the zoning interacting with those pretty large historic districts within the city limits.
Oh, great, and thank you. And thank you for the National Zoning Atlas. That's an amazing work product. Yes, we tackled zoning reform for 2 reasons. One of them started right here in this office with the Regional Housing Initiative that Clark mentioned earlier. That 10-year challenge to provide an increase in housing supply was very important for Alexandria. Our council adopted it and set me and my staff to work to help implement that. So that was a big reason why we started it. But secondly, and equally importantly, we felt that this was well past time for us to address meaningfully the racism inherent in an exclusionary land use scheme like zoning. And so both of those things were went along side by side during the entire process that we used. And in fact, in many ways, the issue of equity was even more central than housing supply, in part because we had a good base to start from. Excuse me. The zoning ordinance that we have had since 1990s actually allows housing in almost every zone, including the commercial zones. And so we have seen that pay benefits because many of our office to residential conversions have been by right simply because we had built that into our zoning ordinance decades ago. In addition, since the late 90s, we've been passing small area plans that increased the capacity for new development by 80 million square feet, much of which is housing. So the issue, though, was not all of that additional development was in every neighborhood. And so we were pursuing through this latest reform a number of steps, including the elimination of single-family detached-only zoning. And so the balance of the city, which was about 1/3 of the land area that was reserved for single-family detached alone, and in some cases duplexes, now is, as you say, able to get to 4 units by right. There were a number of other things that we did, and I wanted to make a connection to historic preservation in part because we did look back to our history as an inspiration for reforms to our zoning ordinance. Old Town is rife with land uses next to each other that are no longer permitted by our ordinance. And so we said to ourselves, these are some of our favorite places in Alexandria, and yet we don't allow them anymore, either because of setbacks, because of units per acre limitations, because of other things. And so those got addressed also in this package. And then finally, in talking about single family housing, the word family is problematic. When you restrict occupation of a housing unit to people who are related by blood or marriage, you are imposing values that on folks. We eliminated any reference to family in our zoning ordinance, which just a practical side benefit of that meant that our former ban on boarding houses immediately went away, because you could have folks in a building that are completely unrelated. So that's kind of a sample of what we did.
Thank you so much. And just on your last point, this idea of family, that's something that, so I worked in Hartford for a bit, and we eliminated that word from the zoning code as well when we overhauled our code in 2016 for exactly that reason, because who is a local zoning board to decide what makes a family? Sort of a basic thing. I mean, we all, some of our families come in the forms that most zoning codes say, but some don't. I also want to just echo what you said about non-conforming uses. So many of our zoning codes, and part of what we've seen at the National Zoning Atlas is that many of the zoning codes zone for they're sort of detached from the reality of uses, and that I think if we did a study, we would see more non-conformities in historic districts from a zoning standpoint than any other type of neighborhood. And to me, that has really been a barrier to the rehabilitation of buildings, to their vibrant reuse. And in fact, in our housing and historic preservation policy statement, we do talk about not just the need for zoning, to sort of address the housing and number of unit type things, but for zoning to really be rethought for historic neighborhoods and our main streets to produce or recreate the vibrant communities that were there. So that idea of nonconformity is a really important one, and I do think it's one that holds back a lot of places. So kudos for addressing that. Now I do want to go back to DC and turn to Ms. Miller, the head of the DC Preservation League, which focuses, I think, on DC. And as you know, lots of neighborhoods in DC are single family or commercial areas. And I wanted to ask you, in light of the sort of land uses across DC, what you think about conversions and how your organization has addressed or supported conversions. So the ACHP, the White House, in its housing supply plan, have emphasized the importance of conversions, and we just heard from Mr. Maloney about the many conversions that have happened within the district. There was also recently an op-ed in the Washington Post specifically about federal buildings being converted for housing. And you know a lot about the zoning changes that are focused on downtown conversions. So long lead up just to say, what do you think are the opportunities and challenges in expanding those types of conversions, and how has the DC Preservation League weighed in?
Thank you for the question. I would say from a conversions perspective in DC, we've been doing this for decades. We have middle schools that have been converted to affordable senior housing and lots of schools that have been converted to housing. So we've done a lot of these conversions from a local level. We have a tremendous number of federal buildings. And of course, as the federal government has been downsizing its footprint, it's looking at the opportunity to dispose of these properties. One project that's coming online now is the Cotton Annex, just off Independence Avenue. It's 562 units of housing that range in price from $1,500 for a studio up to $3,500. And we're talking, this is a 1936 Art Deco building, has sweeping views of the National Mall and monuments. So it's a really great opportunity. I believe David mentioned the regional office building down at 7th Street. would make for wonderful conversion for loft style apartments. So I hope when that goes to GSA auction that people keep that in mind and keep the federal tax credit in mind when doing that. So we're really for it. I think in downtown DC, one of the challenges that we have is of course our height limit. So we have kind of shorter buildings that are on smaller footprints of land. So it's more expensive to necessarily convert them. So corner buildings tend to lend to be a better opportunity, unless it's a larger footprint building that has the opportunity for a core where you can get that, get more light into it. On that note, though, I would say that, as Mr. Maloney mentioned, we did meet this housing goal that the mayor set without changing our historic preservation law or changing the height limit act. So we, as preservationists, are working towards and working with this goal of adding more housing to downtown, adding more housing in other neighborhoods. We still do need to look at the single family zoning aspect of things because that is a large portion of Upper Northwest. And as we've discussed, in the idea of what is a family, I think a lot of people are having a conversation about, and where can multifamily buildings fit into these single family areas that have these larger pieces of land, so they're not just becoming from a smaller single family home into a larger McMansion type single family home where they could be converted into something that reflects the values of the neighborhood and historic nature of the neighborhoods, but can also accommodate a larger group of individuals who could live there.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, you brought up that the height cap, which is, I don't think anybody's proposing that be lifted in DC, right? Or maybe there's sort of the proposal from time to time. So that seems like that's here to stay. One of the things I do wonder about as I walk around DC sometimes is that I feel like there's so much construction activity. Sometimes you do see buildings that maybe have been taken down almost to their facades. And I don't know if DC Preservation League actually has a view on that. Lots of things are happening in the inside of buildings. I don't know if that's something that has come up. And if you do have any sort of insights into any changes to the height cap, would love to hear about those too.
You're correct. The Height Act, that comes up from time to time. We probably every 12 years or so, it seems to kind of rear its ugly head. It's been, the last time it came up was 2012. It went through a number of hearings, a lot of studies. There was a modification made about occupiable penthouses. So that added some additional area on top of the building where you could have occupied space, which allowed for that. So I'm not aware of anything now, but I just wanted to point out that we didn't have to make any of these changes in order to meet the mayor's goals for additional housing. As with regards to facade jobs or facadectomies, DC is very well known for a very early one called Red Lion Row over on Pennsylvania Avenue near the GW campus. And we try not to do that. One thing that we've been pretty lenient on is the removal of what we refer to. We have a lot of smaller, late 19th century buildings that are have dog legs, so to speak. So we've been kind of more lenient in removing the dog leg in order to build a larger building behind and whatnot. The goal is to keep as much historic fabric as possible. It's a pretty expensive proposition to build in DC. And so we try and give the leeway where we can retain the historic character of the building, but also allow for these redevelopment. And I think it's been really successful in a lot of areas. And there are some buildings that you give a little bit more leniency to than other buildings, major buildings on commercial areas or landmark buildings. We have this, the review process allows for the leniency to make the best decision for the project and the neighborhood or the landmark itself. And from DCPL's perspective, we have our project review committee. It's made up of architects, landscape architects, architectural historians, contractors, structural engineers, and we work with the owner and the architect to push and pull buildings so that they can be as compatible as possible within their context, while also trying not to reduce the size of what they're trying to gain, especially when it comes to a housing project.
Thank you for that. And I do want to turn now to Mr. Reed. So your organization works across the region, and I know you've been involved in it for years, and you look not only at individual development projects as they're proposed, but also broader regulatory changes, trends. And I sort of feel like you have a very good view as to what's been happening in the region. And so you've seen Alexandria make its changes. You've seen DC move forward. You've seen developments happen in different ways all around the region. And I'm just wondering if you could provide maybe the bird's eye view. How do you feel that the conversation on housing and historic preservation has evolved, if it has evolved in recent years? How are you seeing? I mean, you could talk about housing generally, or again on the preservation angle. I'd be really interested to hear your insights.
Sure. Well, first off, I want to put in a word for facadectomies, or whatever you want to call them. I lived in one for 4 years, a former Canada Dry bottling plant in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I grew up, which was about 20 years ago, turned into condos. The facade and the Canada Dry sign were restored, and then the building was put behind it. And I like to think it gave me sort of the best of all worlds, this iconic 1940s Art Deco building that I got to call home and that everybody recognized. And all of the wonderful features of a 2006 condominium. Sprinklers, modern stove, closets, so forth. So our organization focuses a lot on housing production, right? Unlocking the tools needed to incentivize home building, recognizing that we have a local, a regional, and a national housing shortage at all price points, and ensuring that we can create more both market rate and dedicated affordable housing across the DC area, especially in communities near transportation, near jobs, near good schools, which you might call like high opportunity neighborhoods. And while I don't think that historic preservation is necessarily at odds with that, my background is in architecture. I came up loving buildings. I appreciate, the fine historic fabric of DC and of our region. I do think there are trade-offs at hand that need to be reckoned with, right? As well as, I think occasionally, the argument for historic preservation used in bad faith to block housing. To be clear, I'm not saying anybody at this table does that. I'm saying that it has been used in the past, and it undermines the good arguments for historic preservation, right? The need to preserve local character and culture, the opportunity to create better and more interesting streetscapes and neighborhoods. It creates a dichotomy that shouldn't necessarily exist.
Great. I mean, just thinking about that last point, I think it's fair to say that, and I think probably no one on this at this table and no preservationist that's I guess doing preservation for the right reasons would not look at some of the arguments that are made in the name of preservation and say, well, that all of them are perfect. And one of the reasons why I in my role and everybody at this table has, I think, been trying to publicly articulate this case for why preservation it should be and it is and should be a really important tool for housing creation is to try to drown out that sort of, I mean, you might call it a NIMBY and not in my backyard type voice that again harnesses preservation sometimes, because as Rebecca said, this is something that's housing creation is something that preservationists do. It's something that we do just sort of ad hoc on the fly now. Tax credits, but you've seen, these kinds of things happening in preservation for its entire existence. So I appreciate that point. I don't think, anybody at this table would take any offense to it. And I think it's something that preservationists need to really, continue to grapple with. I do want to take, though, your observations, I want to just drill down a little bit more from the political perspective. So, I toss out the word NIMBY, the opposite of that, YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. I do want to ask you, maybe just to focus on, or to let us, or to tell us about what you think about the politics of housing and how that's evolved at the local level, at the state levels in Maryland, where you're from, Virginia, where you also focus. And then also, I don't know if you have insights about the incoming federal administration, but there's so many different conversations happening on the political side that I'd be interested to hear your insights about.
Yeah, so a lot of our work is less about individual projects, which I think is where we might butt up against concerns about historic preservation, and more about broader reforms, zoning reform, permitting reform. In Maryland, at the state level, we're very active on issues like housing targets, and sort of setting standards, similar to what DC has done over the past 6 years for each jurisdiction providing its fair share of housing. And in that work, I think I sort of butt up against what I might call like buildings that are old but not historic, or sort of everyday historic buildings, right? We have in this region an aging housing stock. The average home in part of Montgomery County where I live is like 1940s colonial, brick house, right, with a tiny kitchen and tiny bathrooms and tiny closets. That is often sort of knocked down to build a McMansion or blown out the back to put a big addition on it. And these are the neighborhoods where we are having a lot of conversation, not just in Maryland, but also Northern Virginia and Alexandria, about single-family zoning reform, right? This is where the bulk of the land in our neighborhoods in our country is zoned for. It is often built on a history of exclusion and very narrow ideas about what a family is. And it is also a huge opportunity to provide more housing in neighborhoods where people want to live, where our middle class is being priced out, and where working people have been, for a long time, blocked out of neighborhoods with access to jobs and opportunities. To me, that's where the fight is. And it really, I think, comes up against issues of sort of community identity, right? People grappling with what is their neighborhood, who is their neighborhood for, who was the neighborhood built for, and parts of our history that are a little more unpleasant to engage with. So that I think is where the conversation increasingly is in the DC region and in regions like it right now. Montgomery County is exploring a big single-family zoning reform effort right now. I know Arlington's was held up in court. I hope and pray Alexandria does not end up in the same place. But there's a conversation, I think, for me, the one that I want to have more about is, what are the ways in which our needs in terms of housing have changed, right? The beauty and the magic of adaptive reuse, as I was sort of saying about the building I lived in, right, is this opportunity to create a rich architectural context with the modern things that people want, need, and deserve in their homes, right? I hope that answers your question. But regarding the incoming federal administration, I suppose I wish them the best. I was nervous, during the campaign because, Vice President Kamala Harris talked a lot about the goal of building 3 million new homes just in a couple of years to address our housing crisis. The previous Trump administration made similar noises 5-6 years ago before the president-elect made comments, I think, to the contrary, especially when it comes to suburban neighborhoods. So at least for now, I feel like the jury is out. I am hopeful. I think the nicest thing I can say is that I hope they leave well enough alone. I'm grateful that I work primarily at the state and local level.
Okay, diplomatically said, thank you. But I do think so. I mean, let's take it back up to the federal level because, of course, we are a federal body that has most of our involvement in the federal regulatory process. Although we dispense advice, as I mentioned, as requested by state and local government officials and others, and just in our role addressing Congress and the White House. But I do want to just get back to turning from that advisory function back to the regulatory function. So in ACHP's Housing and Historic Preservation Policy Statement, which HUD voted to support, we did talk about the need to update that Section 106 process that I talked about at the beginning of our conversation, and to provide clearer and more consistent methods of reviewing historic rehabs related to housing. So in light of that statement, ACHP has been working with our members, has been engaging the public, has been consulting with tribal nations, state historic preservation officers, and others about I guess for lack of a better word, we might call it a streamlining measure. It would affect HUD projects as well as many other federal agency housing projects across the federal government, and again, private projects that receive federal funding. It is intended to prioritize what preservationists might call the reviews of impacts on what preservationists might call character-defining features or primary spaces or significant facades, as opposed to imposing the full weight of our regulatory process on maybe things that are more minor, or maybe would not be seen as a preservationist as being particularly historically significant. So what that has meant is that this measure has proposed, among other things, the ability for more flexibility, for shortened reviews, for certain interior rehabilitations, for mechanical system and energy efficiency upgrades, for a lot of the projects that would be covered by the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program through CDBG funding, and again through HUD's own rehab. So I'm just going to turn to you, Ms. Fontenot, and maybe describe how HUD has viewed the development of this measure. It's called a program comment, by the way, for folks watching. There's a few more days to provide your input on the draft that's out now, which is the second draft. But I just love to have you reflect on HUD's participation in this effort and thoughts about how it might change HUD's review process.
Thanks so much. And I've been jotting down all these notes, thinking additional thoughts in light of that very question as I've been listening to this great, thoughtful dialogue. Firstly, HUD has applauded the advisory council's release of the policy statement and has really welcomed the discussion and the national discourse that the program comment, the streamlining measure, has afforded all of us. Over the course of the time I've worked in the historic preservation field, one of the things that I have said often is just because we have done it a certain way does not mean that that should be the way we continue to do it. And I think working through these discussions has really forced an important conversation regarding that very thing. So we've heard a lot of things over the last hour, including the importance of local ordinance. We've touched on state laws and requirements, and now we've come back, as you said, and we're talking about federal law requirement. So when I started with the first question, I talked about the complexity of some of the communities and the individuals that we have to keep in mind. In addition to that, one of the things that's both powerful and can be difficult when thinking about HUD resources is that typically the compliance with federal law, like the National Historic Preservation Act, is assumed by local communities and jurisdictions. There is a beauty in that because they are closest to the needs of their communities. But there is a challenge in that because all communities are not created the same. In Alexandria and the city of DC and elsewhere, we may have a robust team of individuals who are capable of doing this work. But in other metropolitan areas across the nation, that's not equal. And so compliance gets hard when you are looking at local ordinance, local requirements, state law requirements, and now federal law requirements that are asking you to do a host of things. When we think about community development offices across the nation, we also know that there is a high rate of turnover of those employees. One of the things we do at HUD all the time in my office is the training and capacity and capability building for those individuals who will be responsible for complying with the National Historic Preservation Act and other laws and authorities like that. But that is a zero-sum game because we never arrive at a place where all these individuals know how to do it and we're doing a great job. There is a constant need for continuing in that journey. And so I put that in perspective too, because if we think about those individuals and some online watching that are Section 106 professionals, you've been doing this a long time and you understand how to navigate it. Ask someone brand new who did not go to school for architectural history how to navigate this, and things get really difficult. So I offer some of that, and then I get to this streamlining measure, which I have really welcomed. We've heard around this table the importance of sense of place, the importance of the uniqueness of and the fabric of communities that we call home. And I believe strongly in that, and I believe HUD believes strongly in that. But I also believe in the Americans for Disability Act, or ADA, access to those small kitchens and bathrooms, ramps to accessing doorways on buildings that are older. I also believe that we have inequitable energy burdens and costs for low-income persons across the nation. And we see this, and we have the data that demonstrates that low-income persons are paying an unequal percentage of their monthly income to energy costs. We also know that there are these great programs that are now available, like the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program and so many more that are allowing communities to think about how to make their housing more energy efficient, more healthy from indoor air pollution perspective, and so much more. But the Section 106 process is being leveraged in a way, in some cases, to make this really difficult. And I don't have quantifiable data that can tell us how many projects a local community said, you know what, we're not going to move forward with this because I have had a bad experience, because I don't have personnel on retainer right now. It's going to take some time to get my staff up and running. And dollars are left on the table because the permitting process is challenging. What I think is really important about this conversation and the opportunity that the program comment provides is that it allows us some additional flexibility in all those spaces. So I look at ADA access, and I see opportunities there with a reduction in the administrative pieces associated with that. I look at interior units and the ability to update those units, including potentially making kitchens and bathrooms larger for access, putting in different types of utilities. There are photos that I have seen of public housing units where all of the piping is exposed and young children can be burned. All of those things are happening in properties that are older than 50 years of age. So can we find a way to say what is really important to us from a historic preservation perspective? How do we keep the sense of place and allow some of this work to move forward so that dollars can get into these units, so that we do not find ourselves in a situation where units are fundamentally unsafe and we are doing nothing but potentially increasing the homelessness population when we are reducing the number of affordable units available to us. And then we can start focusing on the hard stuff. I mentioned the aging infrastructure. We've heard it multiple times. One of the things that HUD released this past year is new standards for rehabilitation of structures. If the rehabilitation is over 50% of the value of the property, one must now look at sea level rise and future climate risk. That includes elevating properties. Let's start having those kinds of hard conversations and not debate things like how do we want to renovate and improve the utilization of an interior unit so that the kitchen is more accessible. And that is where I really see great value in the program comment.
Thanks. And as you know, I agree that we need to exactly take that approach. And I do want to commend HUD for really helping to refine the types of activities that would be covered by this measure. Brian Lesher, the Federal Preservation Officer, is also in attendance today. So thank you, Brian, for your work in that. And we've seen robust participation across agencies, across our members, across our consulting parties to try to refine the draft. And essentially, as Ms. Fontenot said, what it does is it lays out those activities that, from a preservation standpoint, don't need to go through our full review process, including appliance upgrades, moving interior walls within housing units, which would speak to some of the issues that Mr. Reed talked about. It expressly mentions the Americans with Disabilities Act and certain types of improvements that, when done in the way that the program comment lays out, would be able to proceed without further review. It mentions too the abatement of hazardous materials. So not just asbestos and lead, but radon as well. And, the kinds of things that HUD and other housing related agency work tends to touch because we need to do those upgrades for human health reasons. And I have been at events. I've done a lot of events in my role as chair where representatives of public housing authorities have raised their hand and said, well, we've delayed those kinds of updates because we're worried about the 106 review process. And it's our job as preservationists, I think, to define what those activities are. Again, I don't know if you want to call it that we really care about or that, are really what preservation is about, and define out those types of activities where there are other values that can come right alongside and harmonize with our preservation values with no real harm to our process. So for those out there who still wanting to provide comments, please do. But at least my perspective is that I hope we've gotten the list of activities there mostly right in light of all of these competing or harmonious, actually, concerns. So I'm going to turn now to back to our DC SHPO and about this Section 106 review process and the different ways that federal and state agencies can go about proposing alternative compliance procedures, is how we call them, to the 106 review process. And another aspect of that program comment that we've been talking about is housing, building related upgrades, but there's a piece on transportation and attempts to decarbonize the transportation sector by identifying activities related to walking and biking and public transit that might be the types of activities for which no further review might be required. And in researching sort of how ACHP might approach that, I will say that I was really pleasantly surprised to see DC's transportation-related documents, programmatic agreements that really speak to the transportation issue. And I know, again, this is not a transportation panel, but given how housing and transportation are interrelated, given, I think, again, some pretty significant changes in how people in DC have moved around, given the investments that have been made across the city. I mean, I'd love for you to just touch on that angle of transportation, touch on why the DC SHPO did move forward in covering so many pedestrian and biking and transit improvements in your historic preservation measures and documents. And so I'll just turn it over to you for your thoughts.
Sure. We do indeed have I guess you call it a streamlining agreement related to transportation measures with the DC Department of Transportation. That agreement also is useful to us because it provides a staff level reviewer. In exchange for the expedited review of all these projects and the agreement not to have to review a certain number of them, that's what we have gotten in exchange, and it's worked very well. And I think the sort of philosophical reason why we chose to exclude a lot of items for review is that for example, things like bike lanes and a lot of the sort of incidental traffic calming measures that are done and traffic control things that are done routinely now across the city. We recognize the Vision Zero program that the city has to try to get to zero traffic deaths in the city, and many communities have the same thing. So all of this stuff really has a minimal impact in many ways on really core preservation concerns. It has perhaps a fair amount of impact on urban design issues and some things that, sure, there's a sort of argument about our bike lanes doing exactly what they're promising to do and so on and so forth, but it's not really a preservation issue. So it is valuable to us to just stay out of that argument. We don't have such an agreement on housing, and I think it's maybe because I don't think that there is a need for it since DC is such a small jurisdiction. I suspect this may be the same as with Alexandria. we have a small preservation community. We have a small development community, a small community of housing providers. They know to call us. And a lot of these questions just get worked out at our level. It was fascinating for me, frankly, to hear Ms. Fontenot's comments about how some of the problems occur nationwide. And I have to say, I'm sort of shocked that people are arguing over internal questions related to, safe bathrooms and moving walls on the interiors of buildings. We just don't get into that. I mean, it's just not the kind of thing that is worth arguing about and actually worth reviewing. So I don't think we do any review of interiors of HUD projects. So, but we do provide very customized on-demand service to providers and to historic preservation consultants. And I guess, frankly, I think probably we are spoiled. I think, need to maybe value what we take for granted sometimes, but we do have a very supportive architectural community, historic preservation consultant community, many people who know how to set priorities and what to really focus on, what's important. I also wanted to pick up on a comment that Dan Reed made about these communities that are composed of naturally occurring affordable housing, buildings that probably aren't really worth the designation as historic districts, but still are valuable communities. You sort of walk through the communities, drive through, go on Google Street View. You can see these communities are very well maintained. People seem to value living in these communities, and it's important to keep that sense of community and keep that value that it contributes to the city, while also allowing the city to grow. So one of the things that we have done is to very actively survey the city for those kinds of communities. One of the things that we're doing is the African American Affordable Housing Project, which is in part targeted to looking at that. We're also creating a comprehensive online GIS map of all of the district's historic resources, including things that are designated currently, things that we know are eligible for designation either through federal government actions or through our own just analysis of the properties, and also things that are otherwise notable and otherwise worth some attention, but not obsessive attention. As part of this online historic resources map, we are focusing specifically on including affordable housing types. Small apartment buildings, walk-up apartment buildings, concentrations of 4-family flats, which there are thousands of them in the District of Columbia, and they're not recognized as a historic resource, but they're certainly a housing resource. Many of them provide wonderful physical environments, and it's important to try to keep that, again, not spoiling that environment, while also allowing the flexibility for those neighborhoods to grow. So those are the kinds of things we are focusing on.
Thank you for that. And your shock is a shock to me, given what some of the conversations that I've had, including about the program comment. Frankly, we had submitted a first draft or put out a first draft over the summer. And some of the feedback was, well, what would happen if we didn't review interiors? What could happen? And I think part of it goes back to what Ms. Fontenot said at the beginning, which is we've sort of accreted this, our reviews, or we sort of decided that we're going to do things a certain way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think DC proves that in the way that it sounds like you review projects. And as my dad would say, the proof is in the pudding. You've put projects out. I mean, you're constantly creating and rehabbing housing projects here in this jurisdiction. And I think part of it is really this reluctance to maybe let go of that in other jurisdictions. And because of the status, everybody has a status quo bias, psychology 101, right? And I think that it's nice to know that you don't see that as much, but we've certainly seen it to some limited extent in some of the responses to the program comment, which is part of the reason why we continue to convene these types of roundtables and continue to have these conversations to really try to encourage people to say, hey, look, DC has actually been doing pretty well without those kinds of reviews. We've moved housing projects forward, and again, I think that's to your credit.
Sarah, do you mind if I jump in on David's comment just for
Sure,
1
absolutely.
second, just from an advocacy perspective? David's correct that there's it's a small community here that does this. And one of the things, there's a specific project that came to mind up by Howard University. It involves 2 large historic buildings. It's a massive redevelopment. It's adding a hotel, housing, community spaces and whatnot. And one of the things that took place was that the developer worked with the staff at HPO and DCPL for 9 months before they went to the review board. And I have never seen a development of that size pass our review board on the first try. It went. They agreed with the comments of the staff, the comments of DCPL. They got their approval, and then it was delegated to staff and moved on. So I think in looking at cities where you have this collaborative activity really can help streamline the process as well.
Thank you for that. Another good example. There's just one more part of the review process that I want to touch on before maybe taking it a little bit broader or touching on a few sort of last issues. And I want to turn to Mr. Reed for that because you, in thinking about like you when you were speaking, you were talking about weighing values and sort of what do we designate in the first place. And I want to come back to that question of designation, which Mr. Maloney also touched on. And I wanted to focus on how we designate. And so for preservationists, that means how we formally identify something as historic. So that could be on the local register, it could be on the state register where there are states, it could be on the National Register of Historic Places. And to do that, we go through a multi-step review process to decide whether something is significant or has integrity. And then when we're done with that process, we sort of treat all of the resources that are listed on that particular register the same. In other countries, they sort of have a graduated approach where there's a highest level of resources, let's say the Capitol or Independence Hall. There's maybe medium level, and there's sort of maybe community level resources that might not have been designated because they had some great architectural value, but that they were really about community. I wrote a report about the application of design standards to these types of resources at all different levels. And I picked up on something that some preservationists have argued for in the past, which is that maybe we should have a kind of graduated approach to designation so that we can have a graduated approach to the imposition of regulatory and design standards. And I just wondered to what extent do you think that might be a good idea? Have you seen conversations happen about that? Is that something that you guys are thinking about at Greater Washington?
Yeah. Well, I'll admit I can't say I've been part of conversations about this, but I do think the idea has a lot of merit. One of the ideas I was sort of brought up with in architecture school is the city of the soldier building, right? You have these big, important, iconic buildings, that make a community, whether it's the U.S. Capitol or it is the church on the town square in a small town. And then you have these other buildings around it that provide that fabric, right? The background buildings, the apartment buildings, the row houses, the shops, the little apartment over them. And those are, I think, the buildings that sometimes may need less of a designation, right? Mr. Maloney mentioned fourplexes. My family had one in Petworth for almost 50 years. My grandparents bought it in the 70s when they came to this country because my grandfather had 13 kids, and this was the best way for him to allow his kids to grow up as into adults and raise their own kids in this building. It is an integral part of DC's fabric. It is really common. You'll find them in Maryland and Northern Virginia too. They're usually not historically designated because they're from the 40s typically. There was an effort to designate a block of them off of Wisconsin Avenue in Friendship Heights about 10 years ago, which we wrote about on the blog that we run. And Friendship Heights is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. It's a historically very affluent area, historically very segregated community. And this effort came from neighbors, I think, who may not have wanted those 4-unit buildings turned into something more dense. They were not successful. Many of those buildings are now 8-unit buildings. For me, the argument is less about preserving those buildings that gave my family this amazing opportunities 50 years ago and into the present, as it is about giving people the opportunity to do that today. in some cases, that might mean allowing those buildings to have a lower standard of historical designation, so it doesn't become quite as much of an impediment to redevelopment. And at the same time, in a neighborhood of single-family homes nearby, creating the opportunity to create more fourplexes there, while using whatever tools you have available to identify the historically significant homes in that neighborhood or the historically significant styles that are worth giving note to. I am really sensitive to when there are, what I will say in my words, cool buildings in my community that people do not value because they fear either that the argument for historical preservation is being made from a NIMBY perspective, or because they see it as this binary where the buildings are the preserved or it isn't, right? And the preservation is perceived as this difficult, onerous thing, whether for residents who want more housing or for the owner, right? And we're starting to see that, in Maryland with a lot of our mid-century buildings from the 50s and 60s and 70s, buildings that I personally really enjoy, that are just they're just old enough to be seen as a nuisance. And we're losing them because I think it is sort of seen as this all or nothing position. And that's really unfortunate. So I think a graduated system might make a lot of sense.
Thank you for that. And that was such a great example, the house in Petworth. For those of you who aren't familiar with that neighborhood, use Google out there and find it. But I think it's, the way that your family used that building, I think is really indicative. I mean, I think helps to make the case for that type of graduated system. So, it's not something that is being actively proposed, certainly not at the federal level and not in any jurisdiction that I know about, but I do hope preservationists keep it on their radar screen. We have time for maybe 5 minutes, 5 minutes left. And so I wanted to do just a quick lightning round with all of the panelists. Maybe I'll start with Ms. Miller. And really, of all these issues we've talked about today, and a couple that we might not have had a chance to talk about, so I welcome your adding any. What kind of issues do you think that we should be focused on in the immediate term? Again, of the issues we've talked about today, or any others you'd like to add as preservationists, who I think collectively do see opportunities always to continue to improve our approach to housing. So we'll just go down the line, and I'll start with you, Ms. Miller.
Certainly. I think from my perspective as an advocate is, preservation generally has a PR problem. Like we don't do a great job of people really note when we say no. They don't really talk about when we say yes. And so where are the opportunities that we can say yes to? And so I think that doing a better job of, showing up and saying we want to be part of this conversation before it's an issue for preservation, I think is something that's really important for us, and something that we look at as from DCPL as being very proactive, whether it be from a landmarking perspective, or reaching out to the development community about different properties, even mentioning today, that we think, ROB would be a great housing opportunity. So that way that the community knows out there, that whether it be the development, design community, or just the population as a whole, knows that preservation can be part of a solution in the future for our housing issues, and that it doesn't need to be an impediment. Because I'm here as an advocate who wants to work with you. I want nice, diverse communities that are vibrant, and I think we've done a really good job of creating that in DC, and we want that to go forward so that we're not regressing back to a time when people thought that it was exclusionary or anything like that, and that everybody can live in harmonious ways here in DC.
Thanks.
So I would say we should be open to rethinking the way it has always been done. That means federal laws and requirements. That means how do we think about what is eligible? And it means how we can leverage this sense of place and the sense of community that can come from the power of historic preservation, but we face the hard truths about how it has been used in some untoward negative ways. And how do we learn from that to really move forward positively and proactively? We're facing our generation's challenge is the climate crisis, and we have a lot of work to do. Historic preservation has an opportunity to be part of that, and And I think this is the moment to really have those conversations.
I think I'll maybe underline a theme that was raised a lot this morning, which is sort of the importance of establishing priorities. As a planning director, I might have a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning with a group of climate change activists when they are advocating for a stretch goal on climate change. And then maybe in the middle of the day, I'm meeting with open space and recreation advocates, and they're proposing a stretch goal on new development for providing parks, open space, or tree canopy. And then in the afternoon, I might have a meeting of a similar kind. And that's been going on for quite some time. And I think it's very clear that housing supply production, housing production has been the unintended sort of I'll call it victim of all of that. And so the conversation we had this morning about each one of those folks representing a very important issue, understanding what is the most important thing, what is the priority? Because trade-offs are going to happen in an individual development project or local policy, knowing what you really, really need for success is critical.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Director Moritz and Ms. Fontenot said. You know, I like to say that we have a choice between keeping our neighborhood, keeping the physical character of our neighborhoods, or keeping the characters in our neighborhoods. We in this region stand to lose a lot of the people who make this place interesting and great in the name of keeping things looking the same. You know, a lot of my family doesn't live here anymore, in part because it's so expensive. And these are middle class people with good jobs. So I hope that we can really appreciate the urgency of the situation we're in, not just here, but nationally, and be open to solutions there.
I think we're going to find a lot of agreement here today. And I would like to second a few of these comments. First of all, yes, we need to be open to new thinking. We have had in the district the same preservation law operating in the same way for since 1974 or 79. That's a long time to be working on the same system with no change. Second, we need to use all of our tools. There is a place for facadism, and sometimes it is the best compromise situation. Other times maybe not, but look at downtown Washington, look at 7th and F Streets. Most of those buildings are facade preservation projects, and it is vibrant and fascinating. It's the beating heart of the Gallery Place area, and along with the marina. Third, the point about levels of recognition. I want to put that on your radar because we are thinking about that. DC's initial landmarks list that was put out in 1964 did have things organized into 3 levels of recognition. There is a value to that because it promotes this thinking that is needed. People do need to set priorities and do need to recognize that some buildings need to be treated in the most respectful way. Others, it's not that important. So having categories of recognition is really important, and we're moving toward that. So the one thing that I am wanting to advocate for is conservation districts. We did consider that maybe, I think it was maybe 8 years ago in one of our historic preservation plans. It never got traction, but I think now is the time for, especially now that we are about to launch a new comprehensive plan for the district, it's the time to consider whether or not we should not have conservation districts as a tool, especially to deal with this naturally occurring affordable housing. That's an important resource, and we need to protect and preserve and allow that resource to grow in a reasonable way.
Thank you. I agree with all of that. And one of the great privileges of being in this role is to be able to surround myself with people who are continuing to move preservation forward from within, which I think is critically important for the field. So, and by the way, we beat you on 1974. We've been under the same rules since 1966. So there's always opportunities to improve in any field, in any regulatory environment, in any line of work. So just really wanted to echo or to pull that phrase from Ms. Miller, saying yes, showing up and saying yes, and to thank the panelists today for showing up and saying yes to having this conversation. It's so important. Everything that you do is so important and inspirational. And let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.